Sienna was scrubbing the dishes, her mind wandering in distant thoughts, when a sudden wave of dizziness hit her like a freight train. She grabbed onto the edge of the sink, hoping it would pass quickly. But instead of relief, a sharp, intense pain gripped her abdomen. Instinctively, her hand flew to her swollen belly, which was now 7 months along. It was far too early. This couldn't be happening. The baby wasn't supposed to come yet, but the contractions were unmistakable, strong and agonizing. Her legs wobbled beneath her, and with her vision blurring, she stumbled toward the phone she had left on the kitchen table. Every step felt like a battle, and her mind swirled in a haze. Somehow, she managed to call a cab. When the cab finally pulled up, the driver, a burly man in his 50s, saw her distressed state and rushed to help. "Please, to the hospital. Fast!" Sienna gasped, clutching her belly, her breath shallow and uneven. The cabbie, visibly rattled, slammed his foot on the gas, the car lurching forward as they sped through the streets. For Sienna, every second felt like an eternity. Between the nausea and the overwhelming dizziness, time stretched unbearably. Every passing minute was a torment. When they reached the hospital, staff quickly whisked her into a wheelchair. She could barely speak now. Her words were jumbled, and her vision was fading. "Don't worry, ma'am. You're in good hands now," one of the nurses reassured her as they hurried her down the hall toward the delivery room. Dr. Matthews, a seasoned physician with a steady demeanor, immediately assessed the situation. Sienna's cervix wasn't dilated enough. There was no time to wait. "We need to perform an emergency C-section. Prep the room," he commanded with authority. The nurses sprang into action, preparing the tools and getting everything ready for the procedure. As per protocol, Dr. Matthews stepped out to scrub in for the surgery. The minutes dragged on, and the nurses and assisting doctor waited anxiously. But Dr. Matthews didn't return. One of the nurses, now visibly concerned, went out to look for him, but came back empty-handed. "I can't find him anywhere," she said, her voice laced with worry. Just then, the door to the operating room swung open, and a man stepped in, fully dressed in sterile surgical scrubs. His face was concealed behind a mask, and he remained silent. He brought his hand to his throat, motioning as if he couldn't speak, perhaps due to laryngitis. The assisting doctor, puzzled but thinking quickly, understood the gesture. Everyone in the room assumed this man was Dr. Matthews, returning to perform the surgery. All eyes were on him, waiting for him to take charge. But instead of proceeding, the doctor gestured toward the assisting physician, signaling that he should continue. "You want me to do it?" the assisting doctor asked, surprised. The masked doctor nodded silently. Though unusual, it wasn't unheard of for lead surgeons to delegate routine procedures to their assistants. A bit nervously, the assisting doctor accepted the task and began the C-section, under the watchful eye of the supposed Dr. Matthews. Everything seemed to be going smoothly. Then Sienna, barely conscious, opened her eyes. Despite the doctor's mask, something about him felt familiar to her. Panic surged through her. She tried to scream, but all that came out was a strangled whimper. Her trembling hand pointed weakly in his direction, attempting to warn the others. The nurses rushed over, mistaking her reaction for an anxiety attack. "It's okay. You're safe," one of them whispered soothingly, stroking her arm in an effort to calm her down. But the masked doctor made another gesture, this time toward the anesthesiologist. "General anesthesia?" the anesthesiologist asked, hesitant. The doctor nodded again. Though it was not standard procedure, the anesthesiologist complied. Sienna slipped into a deep sleep, and the surgery continued under the mysterious doctor's supervision. The baby was finally delivered, his tiny cries echoing through the room. A collective sigh of relief washed over everyone present. Some of the nurses even clapped softly. The assisting doctor, beaming with pride, handed the scissors to the silent doctor, expecting him to cut the umbilical cord. However, the man seemed clumsy, hesitant. He finally managed to cut the cord, but something felt off. As the doctor cradled the newborn in his arms, the baby's cries abruptly stopped. The operating room, which had been buzzing with activity just moments before, suddenly fell into complete silence. The baby, now quiet, opened his eyes and locked his gaze directly onto the doctor's. What happened next was utterly unexpected. In a voice so faint it was almost imperceptible, the baby said something. It wasn't just a babble or an incoherent sound, but a clear word. Though no one else seemed to notice, the doctor heard it distinctly. Shaken, he broke the silence. "Did you all hear that?" he asked, his eyes wide with shock as he looked around at the others. The nurses and surgical team exchanged confused glances. None of them had the slightest idea what he was talking about. "Did you hear what the baby said?" he repeated, this time his voice trembling. But everyone stared at him, speechless, unsure of how to respond. The doctor, growing more agitated, clutched his head with both hands, clearly struggling to comprehend what he had just heard. It was obvious that no one else had heard the baby speak. "Get him away from me!" the doctor suddenly shouted, panic seeping into his voice and shattering the stillness of the room. His hands, which had once been steady, began to tremble uncontrollably. Without warning, he let go of the baby, who gently landed on his mother's chest, still unconscious from the anesthesia. The team, frozen in shock, failed to react in time. No one understood what had just transpired. Without uttering another word, the doctor turned and bolted from the operating room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Everyone stood there, stunned, struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The nurses quickly rushed to check on the baby, who had started crying again as soon as he landed on his mother's chest. No one could make sense of the doctor's sudden departure or the strange scene that had just unfolded. One of the nurses, still shaken, spoke up. Something was off about the doctor. Ever since he came back into the room, he was acting weird. I think he believed the baby spoke to him. The others looked at each other in disbelief. It made no sense. Babies, especially newborns, simply can't speak. Neurologically and physically, it's impossible. A newborn's brain hasn't developed the necessary connections to process language, and while their vocal cords are functional enough for crying, they aren't capable of forming words. Even so, an eerie unease crept through the room. Some of the staff held the baby close, trying to calm him, even leaning in to listen in case he might say something else. But the baby just kept crying, his wails filling the air like any other newborn. The tension in the room grew heavier, punctuated only by the faint murmurs of disbelief, until a sharp beeping pierced through the noise. The heart monitors suddenly blared in warning. "She's crashing!" one of the nurses screamed as she rushed toward the machines. With the main doctor gone, the attending physician took over, snapping into action. "Give her 1 milligram of epinephrine, now!" he ordered, his voice urgent, quickly calling for the defibrillator. "We're losing her!" he shouted as the pressure mounted. "It must be the general anesthesia," the attending doctor muttered anxiously. The anesthesiologist, visibly nervous, tried to defend himself. "I only followed the orders. It was the doctor who called for general anesthesia," he stammered, his eyes wide with guilt as the situation spiraled out of control. Meanwhile, one of the nurses continued to cradle the baby, keeping him away from the chaos swirling around them. The baby, still crying, remained oblivious to the frantic efforts to save his mother's life. Sienna had already been broken, devastated by the loss of her husband, Ethan, Then there was Derek, a man who had always been polite, but over time Sienna had begun to notice something unsettling. Every time she visited the office, his gaze lingered a bit too long, making her uncomfortable. At first, she brushed it off, dismissing it as nothing more than awkwardness. But one day, when her husband wasn't around, Derek crossed a line. He confessed his feelings to her. "I've loved you in secret all this time, Sienna," he said, stepping far too close. Before she could react, he grabbed her from behind, holding her tightly. Sienna, shocked and terrified, barely managed to break free and slapped him hard across the face. "Don't you ever touch me again!" she screamed, trembling with fury. "I love my husband, and besides, I'm carrying his child. If you come near me again, I'll tell him everything." Derek, his face flushed with anger, glared at her with a threatening intensity. "You will be mine, sooner or later," he muttered under his breath before walking away. Sienna nearly told her husband about the incident, but decided against it when Derek appeared to act normally in the following days. She desperately wanted to forget what had happened, but 3 months later, her world was shattered. The authorities called with the kind of news no one ever wants to hear. Her husband had died in a car accident. In a state of shock, Sienna went to identify her husband's body. Broken by the grief, she noticed a voicemail from him, left just before the crash. Her heart ached at the sight of it, but she couldn't bring herself to listen. The overwhelming emptiness consumed her, and the thought of hearing his voice one last time paralyzed her with sorrow. Deep down, she felt as if her husband had tried to say goodbye, but she hadn't answered. That thought filled her with crushing guilt, and the anguish of missing that final conversation haunted her relentlessly. The message remained unheard, a painful reminder of what was lost. As the investigation unfolded, Sienna learned that Derek had been driving the car. He claimed to have lost control, veering off the road and crashing into a tree. Derek had managed to escape the burning vehicle, but Ethan, knocked unconscious by the impact, was trapped and consumed by the flames. A dark suspicion began to grow within Sienna. Could Derek have caused the accident on purpose? She had no proof, only the gnawing feeling in her gut that wouldn't go away. At the funeral, while Sienna wept alone, Derek approached her once again. "Now you're free," he whispered with a twisted smile. "I still love you." Without thinking, Sienna slapped him again. "I will never be yours. The only man that matters in my life now is my son." Derek's lips quivered with anger as he responded coldly. "The only son you'll have will be mine." A chill ran down Sienna's spine. Fear gripped her in a way she had never experienced before. What if Derek had truly orchestrated her husband's death? If he had killed Ethan to claim her, could he now be planning to harm her unborn child too? The terrifying thought consumed her. With that chilling realization weighing on her, Sienna made a decision. She had to leave. She rented a secluded house far from the city, hoping to find peace and safety while waiting for the birth of her baby. Money was not an issue. Her husband had left her a significant amount in savings, along with the life insurance payout she received after his death. With everything she needed, Sienna prepared to spend the remainder of her pregnancy in solitude, away from Derek and the looming danger she felt around her. The constant beeping of monitors filled the chaotic delivery room. Despite the medical team's frantic efforts, Sienna was declared clinically dead. The general anesthesia had caused a severe allergic reaction, leading to cardiac arrest. Everyone in the room was overcome with grief and helplessness. They knew this newborn had already lost his father before he came into the world, and now, just hours after his birth, his mother was gone too. Tears streamed down the face of one of the nurses as she gently lifted the sleeping baby and laid him on Sienna's chest, as if giving him a final moment to say goodbye. At that very moment, the infant began to wail loudly. The sight of the tiny baby seeking his mother's warmth, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding around him, shattered the hearts of everyone present. He didn't know his mother was gone. He only knew the instinctual need for her. The room was heavy with sorrow, the baby's cries echoing the unspeakable loss. The infant's wailing echoed throughout the room until one of the nurses attempted to lift him. Yet the little boy, with his tiny hands, clung desperately to his mother's body, refusing to be separated. The sight was heartbreaking, and no one knew how to react. Finally, one of the assisting doctors decided to take matters into his own hands, stepping forward to remove the child himself. Just as he was about to pick him up, a shout stopped him in his tracks. "Doctor, look at the monitor!" one of the nurses cried out, her voice laced with alarm. The heart monitor revealed a faint but unmistakable pulse. Sienna was breathing, weakly, but still breathing. It was nothing short of a miracle. "Quick! Inject 1 milligram of epinephrine," the doctor ordered, acting swiftly. Gradually, Sienna's vital signs began to stabilize. The medical team watched in disbelief as they witnessed the impossible unfold before them. Spontaneous cheers erupted, and the room was filled with tears of joy as staff embraced one another, overwhelmed by the incredible recovery they had just witnessed. Sienna slowly regained consciousness, her eyes fluttering open as she gazed at her baby. With trembling arms, she pulled him close, showering him with kisses before breastfeeding him. The scene touched everyone present, leaving no dry eyes in the room. But the joy was abruptly shattered. Sienna's eyes widened in panic, and a terrified scream escaped her lips. "Derek!" The room fell into stunned silence as everyone turned to look at her, confused and unsure of what was happening. The assisting doctor cautiously approached her, trying to soothe her. "Sienna, what's going on?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Still in shock, Sienna screamed again, her voice filled with urgency. "Derek, you have to stop him. He's dangerous." Desperation dripped from her words. She struggled to explain, her voice quivering with fear. "That man wasn't a doctor. That was Derek, my husband's former assistant. I'm sure he wanted to hurt my baby," she cried out. The medical staff exchanged bewildered glances, unsure of what to believe. Sienna quickly recounted her suspicions about Derek, how she believed he was involved in her husband's accident, and now he had targeted her child. As soon as she finished speaking, the doors to the operating room burst open, and the real Dr. Matthews staggered in. His face was battered, and a noticeable bruise marked his forehead. To everyone's shock, he was barely dressed, wearing only his underwear and a hospital gown, his body bruised and disheveled. "Doctor, what happened to you?" one of the horrified nurses asked, rushing toward him. Gasping for breath, Matthews explained, "I was washing my hands, getting ready to return to the OR, when a man in a hoodie approached me. He said there was an emergency, that someone had collapsed in the stairwell. He begged me to follow him, and I did. But when we got there, no one was around. That's when I felt a blow to the back of my head." The room fell into stunned silence as they listened, unable to comprehend the gravity of his words. Matthews continued, his voice shaking. "I was barely conscious, but I saw him strip me of my scrubs and put them on himself." Matthews paused, reliving the terrifying moments. "Before he pulled the mask over his face, I caught a glimpse of him. After that, he tied me up and left me in the basement. I managed to free myself and ran here as fast as I could." "Did he threaten you?" the assisting doctor asked, his face pale. Matthews nodded. "He said he'd kill me if I didn't tell him how to stop a newborn's heart," he recalled, shuddering at the memory. At first, I refused, but he beat me so badly I had no choice. I lied to him. I told him it could be done with a glucose injection. Glucose is harmless. It's just sugar that provides energy to the body. But he believed it was lethal. The nurses and doctors exchanged looks of dawning realization. It wasn't Dr. Matthews who'd been in the room with them, it was Derek, clumsily cutting the umbilical cord and behaving strangely throughout the delivery. Alarmed, they quickly notified hospital security. One of the security guards, upon hearing Matthews describe how the man had briefly revealed his face, grew thoughtful. If his face was exposed, maybe the security cameras caught it, he said. With that, the group hurried toward the security office, hoping for a clue that could lead them to Derek. Sienna sat in a wheelchair, her young son nestled on her lap. With the help of Dr. Matthews, they were able to pinpoint the exact moment and place in the video where the man briefly pulled off his hood, revealing his face. As they watched the footage, Sienna's anxiety was palpable. Suddenly, she let out a piercing scream. "It's him, Derek!" she cried, her body trembling uncontrollably. On the screen, they all saw the imposter disguised as a doctor tying up Dr. Matthews in the basement. The video then showed the man heading towards the storage room where medical supplies were kept. He rummaged through the shelves until he found what he was looking for, the glucose solution Dr. Matthews had told him about, using it as part of his deceit. With a chilling expression, the man filled a syringe with the solution, slipped it into the pocket of his coat, and walked towards the operating room. Inside, he waited for the perfect moment, when no one was paying close attention, and discreetly pulled out the syringe. The camera captured him holding the baby, seemingly preparing to inject him with the liquid. "Oh my God," whispered one of the assisting doctors, horrified by what they were seeing. But just as the imposter was about to proceed, something happened. In the video, everyone saw Derek stop abruptly. His eyes widened in shock, as though he had been startled by something. It was at that precise moment that he released the baby, just as everyone in the operating room had witnessed. What made him stop? One of the security guards asked, still puzzled. A nurse, her voice shaking, responded, "The imposter said he heard the baby speak. He said something, and it frightened him." The video had no sound, but they could all see that, at that very moment, the infant stopped crying and stared intensely at the supposed doctor. His lips seemed to move, although it wasn't clear if he had truly uttered a word. The whole scene sent shivers down everyone's spine. They exchanged bewildered glances, trying to understand what the baby could have said, if anything at all, that would terrify a man as cold and heartless as Derek. No one could make sense of it. The word, if any, remained an unsolvable mystery. But Sienna didn't care what it was. With tears streaming down her face, she held her son tightly, convinced that he had saved them. One of the nurses had mentioned that Sienna had been clinically dead, and to everyone's astonishment, it was the sound of her son's cry and his tiny embrace that had seemingly brought her back to life. "You're my little hero," Sienna whispered, her heart swelling with an indescribable gratitude toward her son, who had unknowingly pulled her back from the brink. The security guards wasted no time in notifying the authorities. Given the dangerous nature of the suspect and believing he was still nearby, a manhunt was immediately launched in the area. Not long after, a radio message came through from one of the patrol units. "We've spotted a man in a doctor's coat walking down the main avenue. He looks suspicious." When officers tried to stop him, the man bolted the moment he heard his name called, but he didn't get far. The patrol car quickly caught up with him, and he was apprehended. A few moments later, a photo was sent to the hospital, and both Sienna and Dr. Matthews recognized him at once. "It's him," Sienna said, her voice quivering. When the officers searched his belongings, they found the syringe filled with glucose solution tucked into the pocket of his coat. There was no doubt. It was the same man who had tried to harm her precious child. "The suspect has been arrested," one of the officers announced firmly. The news brought a wave of relief to everyone in the hospital, especially to Sienna. With her little one in her arms, she let out a long, deep breath she had been holding. At last, the threat had been neutralized, and she felt a comforting sense of protection with her tiny hero by her side. The days went by, and as Sienna played with her son, she would ask him, her voice tender and affectionate, "What did you say to that bad man, my love?" Her child, with wide, innocent eyes, would simply smile, as if it had all been just a game. She lifted him up and showered him with playful kisses on his belly, causing him to burst into fits of giggles. For a moment, in those sweet sounds of his laughter, she found the peace she had longed for. Yet, deep inside, a question still gnawed at her heart. Finally, she gathered the strength to listen to the last message her husband had sent her, the one that had come just before the accident. For weeks, she had avoided it, afraid of the overwhelming pain that would come with hearing Ethan's voice one final time. But now, she knew it was time. She glanced at the time the message had arrived. 3 in the afternoon, the exact time the officers had told her the crash occurred. Sienna decided that her son should hear his father's voice too, so she put the phone on speaker. "It's important for him to hear his dad," she told herself, though her heart pounded in her chest. She hit play, and Ethan's voice filled the room. At first it was a relief, like a balm for her aching soul, but it quickly turned to dread. Her heart froze as the recording played on. "Derek, what are you doing?" Ethan's voice was frantic, filled with desperation. "You're out of your mind. We're going to die." Then Derek's voice followed, cold, detached, chilling. "That's exactly what I want, to kill you," he said, his tone icy. "Don't worry about Sienna. Once you're gone, she'll be mine. And as for your son, I'll take care of him too." Sienna felt her world crumble. The sound of a struggle, followed by her husband's gut-wrenching scream, filled the air. Then, the violent crash. Tears poured down her face, uncontrollable sobs shaking her body. The truth she had dreaded for so long was now undeniable. Derek had intentionally killed her husband, and now she had the proof she feared to find. Clutching her child tightly and gripping the phone with trembling hands, she rushed to the police station. Once there, Sienna recounted everything, every detail. The officers listened to the recording carefully and confirmed that Ethan had dialed her number just before the accident. It seemed clear that Derek hadn't realized the call was still active, allowing his entire murderous plan to be captured. With that evidence, they had enough to ensure that Derek would spend the rest of his life in prison. Sienna, still holding her son, cried, tears flowing freely down her face, but this time they were tears of relief. She finally knew the truth. However, her relief quickly turned into burning rage. Before she could stop herself, she headed towards the jail cells. Moving unnoticed, she slipped down the hallway where Derek was being held. There he was, lying on a bed, smug and unaware of what was coming. Sienna couldn't hold back. "Derek!" she shouted, her voice shaking with fury. "I have the proof. You killed my husband. You'll rot in jail for the rest of your life." Derek sprang up at the sound of Sienna's voice, ready to snap back at her, but then his eyes fell on the child in her arms. His entire demeanor changed in an instant. His face drained of color, and his eyes widened in pure terror. He started screaming, his voice high-pitched and hysterical. "Get him out of here! Get him away from me!" he shouted, frantically trying to cover his ears. Sienna, stunned, watched as her little boy gazed unblinkingly at Derek. In that moment, she thought she heard something, a word, clear and unmistakable, coming from her child's lips. Murderer. Sienna froze. The word echoed in her mind, leaving her breathless. Derek, on the other hand, was thrashing in fear, screaming as though the child was a living nightmare. The officers rushed in, pulling Sienna and her son away from the chaos. As Sienna walked away, she found herself wondering whether she had truly heard that word, or if it had merely been a figment of her imagination. Yet, in the end, it didn't matter. What mattered was the deep sense of peace that settled over her, a quiet joy blooming within as she held her son close. He had grown up, sheltered and nurtured by the love and strength of his mother, and that was all that counted. If you enjoyed this story, I encourage you to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. See you soon. May God bless you. Wow, what a journey, right? This story was such a whirlwind of emotions, and while it's pure fiction, it certainly got us thinking. Sienna's experience, from the heartbreak of losing her husband to the terror of facing someone as dangerous as Derek, really touched on some deep fears, ones we all have in different ways. But amidst all that darkness, there's also light. Her son, though just a baby, became her reason to keep fighting. What really struck me about this tale was the theme of resilience. No matter how much life threw at Sienna, loss, fear, even near death, she never gave up. And that's the lesson I think we can all take away from this story. Life can be unpredictable, and sometimes it feels like everything is falling apart. But the strength we find in the people we love can pull us through. For Sienna, it was her son who gave her that strength. For us, it might be family, friends, or even just the hope for a better tomorrow. Now, I know stories like this can leave you with so many questions and thoughts. Did that baby really say a word? Or was it all in Sienna's mind? Was Derek always this twisted? Or did something push him over the edge? I'd love to hear what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and let's discuss. And if this story moved you, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales like this. Thank you so much for being here with me, and I can't wait to hear your take on everything. Until next time, stay safe, and may you always find strength in love.